Come on! Alright, let's try and get across. Come on. Alright, where do I go from here? Oh, damn! Shit. Yo, what is up guys, it's Tyrannic Swine here and welcome to another game review. This time I am reviewing Gears of War 2. This is the second installment to the Gears of War franchise made by Epic Games, and it continues on where the first game left off. A few months have passed as winter has approached the world of Sarah, and the COG are planning to mount one last huge attack on the Locust home territory, which is underground, as seen as they only have one major settlement left, which is Jacinto. But along the way, while Marcus and his crew are trying to basically fight the Locust, they discover more dark things and more about their origins throughout their journey within this game. Now, Gears of War 2 is a lot more interesting for the first Gears of War game, because Gears of War 2 has the big problem of having to continue on and expand upon the story that the first Gears made, or started out with. And Gears of War 2 really does accomplish that. You actually find out a lot more about the Locust and what they are doing, like why they are attacking the humans on Sarah. And it is really interesting to find out more about them, along with the fact that you get to know the characters a bit more in this game too, since you still have the characters from the first game, Marcus, Dom, Baird, and Cole. It does concentrate a bit more on Dom, especially since it has like a little story for him, since he's trying to find his missing wife. And if you play the game, you pretty much know that doesn't go too well. The characters in this game, as usual, are still very much the way they were from the first game. They're still very funny to listen to with their continuous arguments, and it's pretty much, that's all they do really. It's like they talk tough and pretty much joke around a lot. And they always seem to like get into the most stupidest situations that they always have to fight through. But I really think the characters were done specifically well in this game, along with the backstory and the lore of the world and the Locusts themselves. There's a lot more things that happen too, since there's a few secret things that they discover, like a secret facility that was used to like turn humans or something into Locust type creatures. I don't know what they were called sirens, and it doesn't really give you much background on those things, to be honest, after this game, but I really didn't know what their purpose was, to be honest, but they were kind of creepy. And then you have the Locust Queen herself that you find, and it kind of makes things a little bit more complicated, since the Locust Queen is humanoid in some ways, and making things a bit more confusing about where the Locust came from, because it never really does explain it even in the playthrough. But nonetheless, there is some new characters that are introduced in this game, but much like with the first Gears of War game, they're killed off pretty much straight away, like within the first two acts, and then after that, that's pretty much it. The problem with these first two Gears games is that whenever you see like a character that isn't as major as the main ones, like the Delta Squad that you're playing with, they tend to get killed off very quickly in this game, not giving you a good amount of time to get to know them. But luckily they solved this problem in the third Gears game, but for now, it's like there were some interesting characters introduced in this game, but they were killed off immediately. Pretty much early on in the game, pretty much the first half. And that sucked, kinda. But overall, I think the story and the characters were done much better compared to the first Gears of War game. Now, there are a few game mechanics added into this game compared to the first Gears of War. There are now chainsaw duels, which is where both you or the enemy have a lancer and then use the chainsaw at once. You can stick grenades to walls to set up as traps, or you can stick them onto enemies if you melee them with a grenade. Or when an enemy is in the down but knocked out animation, you can pick up their body and use it as a shield for a limited time, but you can only use your pistol when it happens. I think that these are pretty interesting mechanics to put in though, since over the course of the Gears games, not a lot of mechanics are introduced that are new, but it still keeps the game going in some ways, and it does improve them. There's a few differences in weapons. There's a few new ones, like the Scorcher, the Gorgon pistol, Some of the weapons have changed as well, like the Lancer is a bit more longer range, and so is the Hammer Burst. But the Hammer Burst is no longer 6 burst, it is no longer 6 burst fire, it is now semi-automatic. The Nashor isn't as longer range compared to the first Gears game. But yeah, there is a few notable differences with weapons and a few new ones, and I think they get the job done mostly. And I think they were done very well. And you can still pretty much use like 2 primaries, a pistol, and a grenade. There is a few new grenades as well, since there's now grenades like the smoke grenade, and the ink grenade, instead of just the frag grenades which were in the first Gears game. And mostly I think the weapons were very interesting. Now, the enemies of the game are also a little bit different too. Well, there is more of them compared to the first Gears game. The Locust, there is like ones like the Cantus that are like used as medics. There's enemies like they're called blood mounts, tickers which are used to like blow you up, basically suicide enemies. And then there's like a bunch of other enemies like the maulers and the grinders which use heavy weapons. Now the game does introduce heavy weapons as well. Now these can be picked up, but you can't necessarily keep them with you, nor will you be able to pick up ammo for them if you find another version of them. So basically they're disposable weapons, but they are useful for saving ammunition or going up against a lot of big enemies, and I think they're pretty useful. The enemies in this game again I don't know if they're more difficult to fight compared to the first Gears game. I think it was the difficulty was pretty much the same. Maybe it was tougher in some enemies since there is a lot more different types of enemies and they can be a pain to take care of. And I think the length of the game was also pretty decently. It probably takes like 10 to 11 hours since it's like 5 acts and about 5 to 6 chapters per act. So it's a bit longer is this game compared to the first Gears game. Overall, I think the mechanics and the enemies of this game were actually done decently. I think they were done a lot better than Gears 2. Well, Gears 1 I mean. And I think it was done particularly well. Now, another thing is the level design of this game. The level design of this game is very interesting. It's a bit more open, I think, than the first Gears of War game. Most of the time you spent underground. I'd say pretty much most of the game you are spent underground. Probably throughout the second act, the fourth and the third act, you're pretty much spent underground too. There are bits where you're up on the surface, and you get to see more of the Sarah, but most of the time you're going to be spent underground, since you are invading the Locust's home territory. And I think it's very interesting with the way the world looks. Aside, there was a lot of nice looking, like, different underground plants and like that. There's also the Locust city nexus. I really did like the way the Locust architecture looked. It showed that they weren't such a monstrous species, that they did actually have some sort of architectural side and artistic side to show that they are in some ways civilized. And I thought that was very interesting that we got to see more of what the Locust home looked like, and the fact that when you're on the surface you can see more of like the destruction of what has happened in war on Sarah. Not only that, there's also multiple parts around the game where you're in sort of vehicles, much more compared to the first Gears game. The Gears game you're pretty much in an armored personnel carrier, or a junker is what it's called. For pretty much one section of the game, and that's pretty much it. This game has like about 3 or 4 sections where you're in vehicles. There's like a section for the Centaur, which is the tank of the game. There's 2 moments in the game when you actually get to control Locust enemies like the Brumac and the Reavers. You get to control those, which was actually very interesting. But sadly, this is the only time you really get to see that in this game, which is what makes Gears of War 2 a bit more unique among the Gears games, because it's actually one that tries to do a lot more different things compared to the other Gears games, especially when it comes to having unique parts of the campaign, which is like these vehicular moments. You don't see these kind of things all that often in Gears 3, which kind of does suck a little bit. But other than that, it was great to have these moments in the game. Now there is also boss battles in this game too, and these were pretty interesting. They were much more interesting than the final boss battle in the first Gears game, but the final boss battle itself in this game is even worse than the first, since all you're doing is pointing the Hammer of Dawn at a giant worm monster, and that's pretty much it. All the other boss battles, though, before that, are much better, like the Leviathan and fighting the Scourge. These were very interesting boss battles, and they were very fun to do, and you really had to make sure you would avoid their attacks and everything, and pretty much try to live as long as you can. And also to make sure that you don't run out of ammunition, since ammunition would be very scarce in these boss battles, as always. And so overall, I think the level design and the boss battles were actually done particularly well. Probably a bit better compared to the first Gears of War game. Gears of War 2 was mainly a major improvement in a lot of areas compared to the first Gears game, but it does really actually show it, just this game. Now, a new addition for this game is Horde Mode. Now, Horde Mode, I think, is actually a very nice addition to this game. Basically, it's where you fight against a certain amount of enemies over the course of a certain amount of waves, and obviously the difficulty gets more, the higher, the longer you last. And I think this was actually a very, I really like firefight type modes in games. Well, not always, it depends on how well it's done, and Gears of War 2 does it particularly well, but since this is especially one of the earliest kinds of Horde mode fight game modes, and it's very simple, because all you do is basically just wander around the map trying to survive for as long as you can, as Horde mode in later Gears games does actually get expanded upon a lot more. Gears 2 is just really simple. It's basically, like I said, you wander around the map, try and find a certain position to hold yourself in, and basically fight against the enemies. There is special weapons scattered around the map which will help out in some way, or unless you kill the enemies and you get better weapons from them. But I think it was still particularly fun to play with Horde mode. It's definitely something nice to play other than the multiplayer. There's not really much to talk about the Horde mode in this game, since it's just very basic and simple. It's like you have a different set of maps. You can have up to 4 people to play with cooperatively, which makes it a lot more fun. This is a game mode that's best to be played with friends than yourself. And that's pretty much it. You just basically try to get all the way to the end, since there is actually a limited set of waves. It's just that the difficulty does get harder over time. And that's pretty much it. Yeah, there's just not much to talk about the Horde mode other than the fact that it's actually really fun to play, and it's something to get you away from the multiplayer at times. It's just something else to play. When it gets to the other Gears games, there's obviously a lot more to talk about for the Horde mode, but for this one, there isn't really. It's just your basic firefight mode, and that's pretty much it. But it is fun to play. I'm not saying it's bad, or that it's not needed. I'm just saying it's just really basic and simple compared to others later on in the future, but this was pretty much a starting point for this kind of game mode. And yeah, I think it was done okay, pretty well. It's just something that's just not a lot to talk about. Now finally, there is the multiplayer. Then the multiplayer is definitely expanded upon much more than it was in Gears 1. There is a lot more maps. There are 10 to be in the standard game, and then there was more introduced over time by DLC. But it has most of the game modes from the first Gears, which Execution, Warzone, Annex, and King of the Hill. But also adds in a few new game modes like Assassination, which allows players to continue fighting even after the leader has been killed. Wingman, which splits 10 players into 5 teams of 2, and Submission, which is kind of like a new version of Capture the Flag, but instead of a flag, you basically use a downed player, basically a downed AI character or something like that, and then you get it to your side of the map. And all these game modes, I think, are pretty much interesting additions to the game. Each of the maps, I think, are done particularly well. They style very nicely. There's a lot of covered-based action points, but there's also a lot of bits where you can use certain advantage points, there's probably a lot of points where you can snipe and stuff like that. There's a lot of defensible areas too. There's a lot of different sections of the map that are made for different purposes. Some are made for big fights, and bits are made for areas where you can pick off your enemies. Not only that, if you're like trying to train for the multiplayer for when you fight against actual players, you can use like AI players to you in the game as well to help you out, so you can like get used to the mechanics of the game, so that then you're ready for the multiplayer. And the AI in this game, even in the campaign, is also a lot more effective compared to the first Gears game. The AI is kind of a bit. It's okay, but not very well done. This game they're a lot better, especially since the down but not out mechanic is in this game. In the campaign, when you go down, your AI companions can now pick you up, unlike in the first Gears game. But in the multiplayer they can't. Well, they can, but it depends whether or not they'll get to in time. Not only that, I think the multiplayer is actually pretty satisfying in this game. Compared to the first Gears game, it's a lot more fluid. I'd say a lot more fluid. I think the soundtrack in this game too is also just as probably either a little bit better, or probably about as good as the first Gears game. Yeah, I think the multiplayer was definitely improved upon, pretty much along with the entire game itself. Gears of War 2 was definitely a major improvement of the first game. A lot of things that were needed were definitely added in this game, and I think that was definitely a good thing. Excuse me, Gears of War 2 is a definite improvement overall. I think Gears of War 2 is it's probably one of the more better sequels to in gaming history, as it really does actually improve a lot of things, and it actually makes things a lot more interesting, a lot better story, much more interesting story. The characters are much better in this one. The multiplayer is expanded upon too. There's horde mode now. So overall, I think Gears of War 2 was actually a very good game. So I'm gonna give it a 9 out of 10. So, that is my review of Gears of War 2. A definitely decent and very good sequel to the first Gears of War game. So, hope you guys have enjoyed this review. Leave a like down below, subscribe, comment on what you think is right or wrong with the game, and I shall see you guys in the next random video.